We're going to get started here. Thanks again for everyone attending our call. This is Energy's call with the Democratizing Development Program, stabilizing communities, advancing housing justice, organizing, and policy strategies in the political moment. We have some great presenters who are going to be giving some perspectives on what's at stake in this political moment and some of the work that's really happening in the field. And we want to have a fruitful discussion, and so I just want to encourage those that are on the call to actually please feel free to add questions, comments in the chat box. We like that to happen if you can throughout the course of the presentation. And the way that we're going to be doing the format is that the presenters is going to have a chance to speak for 8 minutes or so, and then if there's direct responses, Q&A for those that are on the call, please join in. And then we're going to have towards the end just a dialogue and discussion, more in-depth discussion of the role of the field in philanthropy, and how there's a lot of political alignment, and what are people thinking about in relation to the Trump administration and current things that are happening out in the field in terms of gentrification, displacement, and also just overarching housing justice related work. So once again, thank you all for joining the call, and we're going to get started. So NFG is pretty much a neighborhood. Our Neighborhood Funders Group is a membership association of grant-making institutions. We encourage field leaders and thought partners to engage and participate in discussions with philanthropic leaders to ensure that we're connecting our kind of overarching theme around people, place, and power, where field leaders and others cultivate leadership to support economic, racial, and social justice work. So we hope today's conversation is a continuation. We hope to see a continuation of more discussions around this. So we are basically more aligned and more empowered in our day-to-day work. As the Senior Program Manager of the Democratized Development Program, the DDP program is really trying to encourage how do we build capacity for philanthropic institutions to support low-income and communities of color, invest in organizing and power building related strategies, looking at how do we look at development and decision making. So really trying to put the people in the center of that work and try to work with philanthropic leaders and progressive thought partners on how we best do that. So the Democratizing Development Program is a container and what we've been calling as a political home for these strategies from funders and field leaders to kind of strategize and think together how they can make more equitable development in places. So we're going to get started with, like I mentioned, we have several speakers, and I'm going to introduce them in order of their presentation. The first presenter is going to be Dawn Phillips, Executive Director of the Right to the City Alliance and also a Director of the work in the Bay Area around Causa Justa. Our second presenter, and they're going to give more context about some of the work that they're going to do because I wouldn't give it any justice since they know their work best. Our second presenter is going to be Sasha Hawes, who is leading some work with the Grounded Solutions Network. She is the Director of State and Local Policy at Grounded Solutions, and pretty much bring a great analysis around inside-outside game around housing policy. And Sasha and I have been doing some work on thinking about how do we integrate some of the more kind of policy-oriented field-related work into the Democratized Development Program. So she'll be speaking a little bit more about that work as well. And then our third presenter will be Felicia Griffin, who is the Executive Director of FRESC, Good Job, Strong Communities in Denver, Colorado. And Felicia has worked on economic security policy work, state national level work. So I'll be really curious to hear a little bit more about some of the work that she's been advancing in Denver. And our final presenter is Ed Whitfield, who is the co-managing director of Fund of Democratic Communities in Greensboro, North Carolina. And Ed's been a great thought partner with the Democratized Development Program, looking at how do we connect the dots between community stabilization and community-based economic development projects. And so we have a lot of great speakers with a lot of different expertise, and I hope that this conversation, like I said, is a spark. And our goal is to continue having discussions in this space in the DDP program, and definitely encourage people to raise questions in the chat box. So let's get started here, and we're going to begin our first presentation with Dawn Phillips. So Dawn, you can kick it off.
Thanks, Niall. Niall, can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dawn Phillips, and I'm the Executive Director at Right to the City, as well as the Co-Director of Programs at one of our Bay Area member groups, Causa Justa Just Cause. It's an honor and a great pleasure to be on the call with everybody this morning, and I'll be speaking primarily about the work of Right to the City and our national campaign for equitable development, land, and housing justice, which we call the Homes for All campaign. So, Niall, just as a reminder, should I be controlling the slides, or is someone controlling the slides for me? Okay, perfect. Yep. So what you see here is a map representing the location of the different Right to the City and Homes for All member groups around the country. To date, there are 63 organizations in 37 cities and in 24 states. This map also shows, which I won't talk very much about, some of our kind of resource, intermediary, and national partner allies as well. But wanted to mostly highlight the kind of geographic spread of the member and partner groups in the alliance. So the work of Homes for All and the work of Right to the City is really, I think, focused very centrally right now around addressing gentrification, displacement, and what we understand to be a national housing crisis. This is the working definition that we are using as an alliance. We know that for many, when we engage people, policymakers in particular, media, frankly, even a lot of community partners on the ground, there's often a question about, what is gentrification? Is it really happening in my community? How do I know that this is actually what's happening? And so this is a definition that was developed by Causa Justa, one of our anchor organizations in the Bay, and it essentially centers on naming three primary drivers of the process of gentrification. One, that the process is really driven by racialized historical disinvestment. Two, that a second driver is essentially the role of government from the federal to the local level in supporting and facilitating this process. And thirdly, the driver of kind of the profit motive, right? The fact that in many of our communities, there is a very major differential between the value, the current value of land and housing, and the potential value of land and housing with investment. So this, we found, is a really critical and helpful way to kind of center and explain and actually name what the process is and what we understand it to be doing. So this is, if you prefer, a kind of more visual description or visual way to understand the longer kind of narrative definition. And what I want to highlight here is really, that the negative impacts or the negative outcomes of gentrification are many and varied, right? So in terms of our work currently, and for the purposes of today's call, we're essentially focusing on housing insecurity, displacement, kind of land and land use issues. But, the impacts of gentrification go far beyond everything in terms of loss of social, cultural, community cohesion, to environmental degradation, to the loss of political power. So gentrification does have far-reaching negative impacts, as many of you probably know and understand already. So in terms of thinking about the impact of gentrification on cities and local communities, we essentially have summarized it in this way. We understand gentrification to be a form of neoliberal development, and that type of development, in our understanding, is driven primarily by private interests. The role of public agencies and public policy in that process is to support and facilitate private investment in communities. And in this model, communities at best are solicited for input. In our version of the type of development we want to see, we believe that development fundamentally needs to be driven by community residents and community organizations, that the role of public agencies and public policy in that model is to support and facilitate community-driven development, and that in this model, communities do not just provide input, they need to provide vision and ultimately be the decision makers of development questions and development processes. So this is the way that we would describe the ideal or the desired way for us in which community development, land, and housing really happens, in communities across the country. We have a three-pronged strategy that emphasizes what I call the 3 C's. So firstly, community stabilization. Secondly, the community-led, community-driven development and planning. And thirdly, ultimately where we would like this to go is kind of strong community control and ownership of key community resources. So just to flesh this out a little bit, and this strategic trajectory really represents the way in which Right to the City and the Homes for All campaign is laid out on a national level. The work is centered on these three prongs. Community stabilization for us is really around the policies, the work, the tactics that allow people to stay in place in their communities. For a lot of our member groups, this looks like tenant rights, tenant protection work, anti-eviction work, community defense work that keeps people in place. It's basically short-term, immediate tactics and strategies that stabilize communities, individuals, and families. Once you have a strong stabilization program, we then understand that community residents are then in a much better, stronger position to be deeply involved in community-led planning and development, which looks like, community residents, vulnerable residents being at the center of determining essentially what should be coming into their communities, what type of investments, and how to manage that investments best to ensure long-term sustainability. And this we see as a kind of a medium-term, mid-range strategy. Ultimately, where we want things to head is we would like to see, both nationally and at the local level, just a much more significant level of community control over key community resources like land, like housing, and I'm assuming Ed's going to speak to, the notion of worker cooperatives, but basically the kinds of resources that are vital to community health, long-term sustainability, and well-being, in our minds, need to be much more in the hands of community residents. So in this way, a lot of our groups nationally are looking at things like land trusts, cooperative models of ownership, et cetera. But that we understand to be really, in some ways, a long-term vision and long-term goal. So these are essentially the three prongs of our Homes for All and our national work, with many of our programs and our community partners' work falling into one of these three areas. So our assertion is that this kind of locally based, local power building change approach is more critical than ever given the kind of post-November 8th kind of ascendancy of this new Trump administration. Our sense is that there's, that while there's very little room and opportunity to make the much needed change at the federal level, we think that local power building is actually going to be a way to ensure that we are creating strong programs, strong policies at the local level, protecting communities at the local level, and that actually that local organizing, it creates a pathway for change at the regional and at the state level in many cases if done correctly. At Right to the City, we have developed for, over the last 8 years, something we call a translocal approach. And the translocal approach is an approach of elevating what we perceive to be our greatest strength, which is local organization and local power building, and to leverage that strength for larger scale impact. How we're doing this is that our local member groups and our local organizations unite their common struggles under the banner of a national campaign with common branding, common strategies, and common tactics. This simultaneously strengthens the local work while creating momentum that allows us to replicate campaigns across the country in new cities and new communities. And we've seen examples whereby that type of work is leading to regional and state level change. So some of you have also probably heard this type of approach, referred to in the framework of rebel cities in terms of the kind of new urbanism, freedom or sanctuary cities. So we understand our translocal approach to be very much within that trajectory. And I want to quickly, as I start to wrap up, just mention a few victories. So, last year, the kind of powerful buildup of this local organizing work culminated for us in what we call the Renter Day of Action on September 22nd, where 3,500 residents across the country in 62 coordinated actions in 56 cities and 21 states kind of stood up to name the housing crisis that's sweeping nationally and to put out demands everything from rent control to just cause eviction to relocation support, but really kind of articulating a national call to basically push back on the housing crisis. In California, and I think we're going to hear about the work that Fresca is doing in Colorado, which is very similar. In California, for example, we're seeing a really, really powerful show of how local organizing first is now sparking regional organizing in the Bay Area and in the greater LA metro area, where now that work is building up to a Homes for All California build out, which looks like statewide formation and, leveraging local power and local work to be able to actually think about a statewide impact. And in California, what we saw in November was a historic moment where 6 cities simultaneously were running ballot initiatives around a combination of rent control and eviction protection. And this is after a 40-over-year hiatus of not having successfully passed any type of measure successfully statewide. We saw 3 cities winning at the ballot, in an unprecedented historic show of victory and support. And then the last thing I'll name is the kind of capacity building and support that our alliance is doing for groups on the ground. Here are 2 examples. We last year did a national webinar series where we had over 1,000 unique participants in 7 different sessions, including a session where we highlighted Matthew Desmond and his work Evicted, along with impacted residents who had faced and personally experienced evictions themselves. These trainings are, these online platforms are a way for us to provide trainings to groups on the ground, lift up the work and the victories that people are seeing, And along with the webinar series, we release organizing toolkits with each of these series that people then are able to use to push out and develop policy campaigns around the country, so far around rent control, just cause evictions, utility justice, etc. The image you see on the right is the schedule for the webinar series for this year, and we welcome anyone who's on the call to join and be a part of that. So
thanks, Dawn.
Thank you now.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I'll let Dawn go over a little over because there's a lot going on in terms of the national scale. And so, and continuing that kind of similar lens, we're going to pass it on to Sasha. And then, like I said, for those who have questions specifically to Dawn or any questions throughout the presentations, definitely lift up, and we'll be sharing everyone's contact information and all that post-call. So, Sasha?
Hi, thank you. So I'm Sasha. I work with Grounded Solutions Network, and our mission is to cultivate communities equitable, inclusive, and rich in opportunity by advancing affordable housing solutions that last for generations. So I'm going to leave you with that little blurb, and I'm not going to go into detail about all of the different ways that we do that work. But I am going to tell you a story of one particular city that we worked in last year and that we're going to continue to work in this year. And I'm going to try to make it entertaining for you. And I think that it's, I'm really happy that I followed on Dawn because I think that this case study is pretty emblematic of the kind of trajectory that Dawn is talking about from where we are right now in terms of gentrification forces and where we're trying to get to in an ideal scenario. So here's my housing policy tale. It starts in a town some of you may recognize. Is anybody about an hour from Michigan? Anyone on the call? So this is Detroit in 2016. And you can see that it's a far cry from the deserted urban core that many of us remember or maybe have just envisioned from its reputation. And my story about Detroit starts with this man, Dan Gilbert. He owns 4 professional sports teams, Quicken Loans, Jack Entertainment, and a venture capital firm, and a whole host of other successful businesses. Dan is a third-generation Detroiter, and after building his fortune with Quicken Loans in 2010, he moved back to his hometown and relocated the headquarters for Quicken into downtown. So shortly thereafter, Dan began buying up real estate. He has invested over $2 billion locally, and he owns 90 buildings in downtown Detroit right now. And actually, despite this somewhat villainous pose that I love, Dan Gilbert sees himself as Detroit's champion, and he's actually quite popular. He's lionized by a lot of people for his perceived role in bringing Detroit back from the brink of destitution. Now, folks on the phone may be a little bit skeptical about that. So one thing you may also want to know is that Quicken Loans is currently fighting a fraud lawsuit for their questionable lending practices, which the Department of Justice calls a fraudulent lending scheme that involved inflated appraisals, targeted poor credit risk, and borrowers with insufficient incomes. So in other words, Quicken Loans seems to be one of the worst perpetrators of the foreclosure crisis, and they continue their predatory lending practices unapologetically today. Now, let's take a look at some of the results of this private investment trend in downtown Detroit, which, by the way, has been greatly facilitated by massive tax breaks from the city and county, to Dawn's point about public policy facilitating the gentrification forces. I'm sure that all of you have heard that Detroit is back on the map as a desirable place to live for hip, young urban types, and I could not resist this picture. This is from Dan Gilbert's real estate company, Bedrock Detroit's homepage, letting everyone know who they're really welcoming in as new tenants. So businesses are moving in. The population of Detroit is stabilizing, and the tax base is growing. These are really positive things. But the question, of course, remains who's really benefiting from this supposed renaissance, and is it actually widening the gap between the haves and the have-nots in the city? So outside of downtown Detroit, there is basically no investment that isn't led by community development financial institutions, nonprofits, and foundations. Yet the in-migration of these younger, wealthier, and usually whiter people is creating pressure on the rental market. And in fact, over the past 5 years, rents have risen by about 50%, which is huge. So even while large areas of the city remain disinvested and blighted, displacement pressure is definitely beginning. Now enter our champions. To your left is Councilmember Mary Sheffield, and on your right is the Director of Housing and Revitalization, Arthur Jemison. Downtown Detroit is actually Mary Sheffield's district, and she is rightly concerned that the benefits of growth aren't trickling down to most of her constituents. So as a solution, Mary Sheffield proposes that Detroit adopt an inclusionary housing policy. All new development would be required to include 20% of their units for low-income tenants. Arthur Jemison is concerned that this would be counterproductive and it would either kill new development or it would require the city to invest enormous sums into making new construction viable. So enter the wonks. Arthur Jemison brings in a consultant team. It includes Grounded Solutions Network, and here I am in your upper right corner, and here are some of my teammates on the project. He wants this consultant team to analyze Councilmember Sheffield's proposal, of which he is skeptical, and to make recommendations for an inclusionary housing program that could work for Detroit. And I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble with the slide forwarding, so it's a little jerky here. But by being part of the consultant team, me and Zach and really the Grounded Solutions team were able to leverage the respect that we get by being technical experts and being the sort of internal advisors on inclusionary housing to promote what we know works more broadly to create and retain diverse communities. Because we know that inclusionary housing is not a panacea. It needs to be accompanied by other policies like strong renter protections, and it needs a holistic approach, especially in weak markets like Detroit. We also know that local knowledge is incredibly important for good policy making, and that people like us, consultants who parachute in from Oakland, California, need the insight and wisdom of local advocates and local practitioners. So it was really great for me to be in a position in Detroit where I can push the boundaries of both the larger consulting team and our allies, Arthur and Mary. In the end, what we wound up doing is recommending a suite of strategies that included much more than just inclusionary housing. It included a wider use of publicly owned land, preservation of existing affordable housing, creating a permanently affordable home ownership opportunities through CLTs and other methods, funding a local housing trust fund, and implementing a locally tailored inclusionary requirement. So even though this, I think, is a really good outcome for a relatively short engagement, the story definitely doesn't end. Grounded Solutions was able to push for more community engagement in the first time around, but there really wasn't enough. There was neither time nor budget, and as Dawn pointed out, just consulting with local partners is not enough. People need to be empowered in the decision-making process. So what we wound up with was final recommendations that were relatively tentative, internal recommendations with a lot of next steps. This year we're starting a new round of work. We're going to create a public-facing document that results from a much more collaborative and comprehensive process. We'll be putting the meat on the bones of our preservation recommendations and really involving the local nonprofits and CDFI communities to be more productively engaged. Right now there is a lot of will, but there is not a lot of cohesion or direction amongst local funders in this particular way. We're also going to be doing a feasibility study to understand what types of community land trust models would be viable in Detroit. And this is a really exciting opportunity to prevent low-income homeowners from going into foreclosure and also to use a huge amount of vacant housing stock for permanently affordable homeownership rather than allowing those to go for sale to speculative investment. And just as a side note, Detroit does already have a CLT, and both Right to the City and Grounded Solutions have worked closely with that CLT in Detroit. So we're excited to learn from their lessons. So let's talk a little bit about why I bothered telling you the story of Detroit, besides just to show you that really glamorous picture of myself. I think the story of Detroit is typical. Grounded Solutions is currently doing really similar housing policy work right now in Pittsburgh, Nashville, Minneapolis-St. Paul, New Orleans, and Los Angeles. So you see some pictures from some of those cities on your screen. And we are seeing increasingly that small and mid-sized cities are taking matters into their own hands. And what's really cool is that it's all different types of places. It's not places that have traditionally seen themselves as progressive, politically progressive, or hot markets. Everyone is facing housing affordability problems. And the silver lining is that this is generating new political will. I also definitely agree that the Trump presidency has added fuel to the fire. Now cities know that they can't rely on the federal government for help, and many of you probably know that the proposed HUD budget would throw about 200,000 voucher holders into the street and completely gut HUD's affordable development programs. So there really is this imperative to build local plans and local infrastructure for affordable housing from the ground up. There are a lot of hows or tactical strategies that funders and other stakeholders can look to capitalize on this political moment at the local policy level. And I know that many of you are already doing them. I want to check on my time. Niall, do I have 3 or 4 more minutes, or should I skip down to the end?
Yeah, 2 more minutes would be good.
Okay. So first, of course, is investing in grassroots advocacy. The strongest policies get passed when there is both an inside game, a local champion like Mary, and an outside game, of course, of organized constituents who are educated and able to push hard for that initial win, but also to hold policymakers accountable over time, because we know that policies are not perfect when they're first implemented. And if we see that something isn't making a difference in the housing environment, we need those local advocacy organizations to push for something new and better. I would be remiss if I did not mention that we really appreciate the role of philanthropy in making our mission-driven consulting possible. Most consultancies have very limited freedom in their ability to pick and choose their clients. And what that means is that they don't push the boundaries of their engagements, and they don't push the comfort zone of their clients. So I think it really matters who the city listens to as a technical consultant on the policy formation details. Finally, even though winning campaigns is very exciting, the details of the program are just as critical, and Grounded Solutions has 2 teams that are completely devoted to supporting effective stewardship so that affordable units remain affordable for generations and continue to benefit the community. So I do think that implementation and accountability that follows the policy win is really important. And finally, I've definitely noticed that funders have played a very helpful role in helping to connect the dots in some of the places I work. They have helped get the local practitioners and advocates and policymakers to talk to one another. And I think that is definitely a role that folks can continue to play as community foundations who know and understand the landscape in your target investment areas. That brings me to the end of my presentation. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and here's my contact information.
Great. Thank you so much, Sasha. And I just wanted to reiterate the point. So a lot of the things that Dawn mentioned also is right to the city, and the Grounded Solutions kind of work are kind of like 2 kind of pillars in the Democratize the Development program. The right to the city's leadership in terms of engaging, organizing, and also looking at inside-outside strategies from grassroots level up has been really critical in our analysis of the program. And even like the development of the framework of the DDP program is pretty much an extension of the work that Right to the City has done, looking at community stabilization, policy-driven work from the community level, and then also looking at ownership as a strategy through CLTs and other related economic strategies to make the connection between housing and economic benefits to residents. And so I just want to thank you both for your presentations, and the program will continue to be working with them, and I just wanted to encourage those that are on the call, if there's questions, definitely add it to the chat box. So our next presenter is Felicia Griffin, who runs the organization Frisk in Denver, Colorado. So I'm going to turn it over to Felicia.
Good afternoon, everyone. I get to be the midpoint in this webinar, so take a stretch.
I know.
Get off of that email. Just kidding. I'm talking about myself now. And so excited to be with you. And actually so honored to be able to follow Dawn and Sasha. We depend on the technical assistance that their organizations provide us to be able to do the work that we do on the ground. So really honored to be on the call with them. Again, my name is Felicia Griffin. I'm the Executive Director of Frisk Good Jobs, Strong Communities. Also the co-chair of Mile High Connects, which is an important part of our housing policy here in the Denver region. And also the ED of a new membership organization called United for a New Economy. And it is a pleasure to be here with you today. So let's get started. And sorry you don't see this, this chart very well. The chart is actually looking at the Denver region and looking at the number of neighborhoods that are rent burdened. And so I don't know if we can look at it any better. It looks like someone's trying to adjust it. The darkest area is 80 to 90% rent burdened. So as you can see, and the lighter it gets, the less rent burden it is. The big white box in the middle is not any good news. It's the airport. So it's not a great CLT that we've built or anything like that have kept rents reasonable. So just, I wanted to first off start with the data and share the data with you. That Denver is definitely in crisis at this moment. When I think of Denver, I just like to make it easy and fun. By the way, I'm on spring break. So I've got some renewed energy and rejuvenation. This first quarter has been pretty hard. This is what I think of Denver right now. And I grew up here, so it's changed a lot for me. We're creamy frosting on the inside and smooth chocolate on the outside. The gentrification is really changing the face of our communities. We're losing, cultural pieces to our communities that have been historical and part of Denver neighborhoods for years. They're almost gone and completely wiped out. We also are having issues with our public school systems and making sure that they have enough students to stay open in the inner ring of the city. And we are truly seeing in real time the suburbanization of poverty as our communities of color and low-income workers are moving out to the fringes of our city. And so, my funny for this presentation, and let's see if I had a little animation slide, is I don't want to live in a city like that. I want to live in a city that is rich in diversity, where I get to see my neighbors of every cultural background, every color, every flavor. And so, no, you don't get donuts this morning on this call, but I thought I'd have some fun in indicating the kind of city that I want to live in. We are experiencing a housing crisis, and you've heard it over and over. You know what the issues are. And our recipe for success in the Denver region is definitely, as I believe Sasha pointed out, is we need inside and outside game, right? So we definitely need a couple policy work. A lot of our closest policy partners right now are Mile High Connects, Enterprise Housing, and we've connected with several members of our legal community. We also, our friends at Enterprise recently did some polling and a survey that really, folks don't understand what affordable housing is or understand that it actually means them something that they need. And so we're really working in our different coalition and collaboration tables to think about how we talk about this crisis differently because it's impacting such a large swath of our population that we need to find a way that resonates with folks so that they join us in our fight. We definitely need grassroots organizing, and then we are building a statewide housing table that we feel is critical to changing and moving things in Denver and in the state of Colorado. And then also, we definitely are in alignment with all the things that Dawn talked about. We really feel like community land trust is an important piece on the resources and need to be in the power in the hands of our community members. So first, and I would just say this to all of the funders on the line, you know, organizing money for our organization and many of our partner organizing organizations is hard to come by. We're able to fundraise a lot for issue campaigns, but getting money to do deep organizing that includes strong leadership development is really hard to come by. And I have to tell you, we've been doing some strong leadership development in a community in the suburbs called South Westminster, and really providing leadership development in real ways, and the results are phenomenal. And the results are not only showing promise for our issue campaigns, you know, they're going to show promise for all the other battles and electoral battles that we need to be fighting in the next couple years. We have a local We Organize committee in Westminster. Again, we've spent almost a year, and I know it seems like a long time, on leadership development, on making sure that folks are comfortable meeting with elected officials. They know how to do a research action and find out the information they need to know, and they are finally at a point where they have created a platform and demands for the city of Westminster. And those demands are a Renters' Bill of Rights, a housing trust fund, and a housing legal advocate. One of the stories that I wanted to share with you today is, if you look at this picture, I don't know if I have a little wand here. Can you see it? Hopefully you can see my hand. This woman here is Inez, and this is her daughter, Sylvia. Inez lives in South Westminster. She doesn't have a car, but lucky she's right next to our new light rail station. But being in an apartment building near that new light rail station makes her apartment building really hot for development. Her rent has increased $425 in the last 3 years, and she's on a month-to-month lease and cannot get any longer lease than that. She makes $12 an hour, so 57% of her gross income goes to rent. She lives in a one-bedroom with 3 kids, 1 grown son, who also works part-time and goes to school. She's been a part of Wald since we started. We knocked her door. She brings Sylvia, who is also part of the next generation of movement leaders. I hope I can give her my job someday. And I just want to share, we took Sylvia and her daughter with us just this past week to a leadership meeting that we did with the Center for Popular Democracy to Washington, D.C. Sylvia's been a local leader. She's been doing, you know, stepping up, speaking when we're doing presentations to City Council. A wonderful leader. For me, what makes this all worth it is when you finally see the light go on, where someone sees that they are powerful and they can make a difference. I was in tears in Washington, D.C. We ended up doing an action on the ACA, actually 4 different actions on the ACA, including die-ins and civil disobedience. And she would talk to her daughter and tell her daughter, like, we are doing something for our own future. We are changing the future. And the light was on, and she's already one of our best leaders. That's why we took her, right? But I mean, she's unstoppable right now. She's unstoppable, and her daughter wants to be doing organizing meetings with other kids that are coming to meetings with their parents. And so that is what we have to do, not just for our housing campaigns, but for the democracy that we're all fighting to protect right now. And so for me, organizing is the critical foundation that we have got to invest in to really win. If we want to win and we want to save our democracy. And Inez, I needed renewal, and that's all the renewal. I'm back on fire, and we need to have thousands of Inezes out there. The next thing I'm really excited about in the Denver region is 9 to 5, which is another organization ourselves. Got together to organize a grassroots housing table with the ultimate goal of rent control in 2020. We're really excited. We've been getting TA without being members from Right to the City for a little while, but we're really excited that just a couple months ago, our local community groups and leaders affiliated with Homes for All. We are total alignment of those values and totally appreciated already all of the TA and connection we've gotten to California affiliates to really help us with our strategies in the local region. This table currently consists of about 15 grassroots organizations in the Denver region. We've also got individual community leaders that are coming, and when we've gotten everyone together, it's been about 150 people that come to meetings, which is pretty amazing. Again, it's facilitated by both 9 to 5 and FRES right now. Our goal is to begin engaging in a statewide campaign, at least 20,000 Coloradans in the campaign, to really begin to do some really good public education and conversations. Not only are folks experiencing a housing crisis in our urban areas, but also in our rural and mountain communities. And again, this table has an ultimate goal of winning a statewide rent control ballot measure in 2020. We've done a lot of leadership development with folks at the table. We've done some legislative training on how to talk to legislators, and also there have been a few housing bills that we've supported, and we've taken folks to the state legislature to support this year. The other strategies.
Real quick, before you can continue, I just want to let people know this call is an hour-and-a-half call. So we're getting close to the 11 o'clock marker, so I just want to encourage people to stay on, and Whitfield is up next. And so, Felicia, can you take another minute just to close this last round of thoughts? This has been great.
Sure, great. Our other strategy is community land trust. There's an area called Global Area Swansea, where we formed a coalition that has prioritized CLT. We're engaging in a feasibility study right now. Community leaders have gotten training from Grounded Solutions to prepare them to run their own CLT. And I just want to also, again, say that the support we've gotten from folks has been invaluable to make sure that this CLT is actually something that prevents displacement, and it's not, just something that, is for new development, but it actually keeps people in place. And I'll end right here. Our mayor in Denver says, I have the audacity to believe that anyone who wants to live in the city should not be forced out because of cost. And I would say so do we. We've got to cash in on the promises of our elected officials. Housing is definitely a human right, and we're going to work as hard as we can on the ground to keep as many people in place and find housing for as many people as we possibly can. Thank you for the time. I want Ed to have some time. Have a really great day. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicia. I know, Felicia, all the presenters could talk for, this could be a whole session about their individual work. And so I just really thank you, Felicia, for taking some time out of your spring break and bringing that added value and conversation to the table. So okay. Our next presenter is going to be Ed Whitfield, co-managing director.
I'm Ed Whitfield again. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about F4DC and then about one of the projects that we're doing
Ed, are you there?
Locally, but I will be describing our work regionally and nationally as well.
That is great. Thanks.
We are a small foundation located here in Greensboro, North Carolina. This is a picture of our staff. Their smiling faces always bring me great joy. We were founded in 2007 as a private operating foundation working on community initiatives and helping both social justice groups and community groups build what we consider authentic democracy to make communities better places to live. We believe, as this slide states, in the power of ordinary people in their neighborhoods and their workplaces and the communities to understand and solve their own problems when given an opportunity to put their heads together and hear all of the voices that are involved. To us, the essential feature of democracy is, in fact, people thinking together. It's not how they register their opinions. It's not how they bring what they already thought into the room, but it is how people come together and think together and create new ideas that are greater than the ideas that they began with. Our theory of action is rooted in helping communities to do things for themselves, to be productive. We want to facilitate the idea that communities can be their own developers rather than developers being people who come into the community to end up owning an asset that allows them to extract value out of that community. We as a foundation want to invest our resources in the community and not in Wall Street. Part of our work promotes the development of finance itself as a new commons, where land and access to the earth on the one hand is the commons that many of us are familiar with. We want the built wealth, the created wealth, to also be part of the commons that is controlled by finance, and therefore that people will have control over the assets that they need to meet their own needs and elevate the quality of life. We are very much concerned with promoting the permanence of communities and the institutions built in that, and the impermanency of foundations. We're not looking for the day that foundations can continue to hold the level of control that we as foundations have over resources and assets, and communities continually having to come and ask for the things that they need to do the work that they need to do in those communities. We recognize labor as the source of all wealth, including foundation wealth. And therefore, we're looking for ways to put the wealth created by that labor back into those laboring communities from where it was extracted. We very much advocate the development of metrics for foundations to try to decide, is there some reason that we would exist forever and ever? One of the things that foundations often do is call for those groups in the field that are doing work to satisfy the metrics that we establish for them. I think it's high time that we in philanthropy look at what are the measurements that we're using to determine whether or not we are efficiently using the resources that we have access to in terms of doing the work to satisfy the mission that we have. And in all of this, we're striving to answer this question of what would we have to change in order for the logic of the system not to dominate people's lives. And for that, our conclusion more and more has to go along the lines of people controlling the productive assets that are needed to produce the things to meet their needs and elevate the quality of life. That when someone outside of the community controls those assets, then virtually life in that community is controlled by those from the outside. We do work locally, regionally, and nationally. Much of our work is, in fact, rooted in the South. We very intentionally decided that in 2007 when we came into being. And we plan to end it all in 2020. We are indeed sunsetting. We hope that by 2020, our assets will have gone into sustainable community entities that can maintain the work that we find valuable, again, of building the kind of democratic structures that allow people to meet their needs and elevate the quality of life based on local self-reliance and people doing for themselves whenever possible. Our local work is largely centered around the project I'm going to describe in a minute, which is a Renaissance community cooperative grocery store. And we also give grassroots matching grants. And in being faithful to our idea of not trying to increase people's dependency on philanthropy, we require local grants to raise grassroots money to show that there is a connection in the grassroots community and people are indeed interested in what these organizations are working on doing. Our regional work is largely connected with building something we're calling the Southern Reparations Loan Fund, of which I'm also the chair of the board. But the Southern Reparations Loan Fund is part of a larger national cooperative that is looking, again, to put productive assets back in the hands of communities by offering very patient capital to those assets so that they can grow and develop. And then the repayment of those loans come back into something that is democratically controlled by the community itself rather than bankers outside of the community. Our national work has to do with building a financial cooperative of which the Southern Reparations Loan Fund is for the purpose of sharing capital, sharing back office services, and sharing learning through a peer network that we're developing. And we're working with some groups all the way from Richmond, California to Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Detroit, and other areas. Los Angeles is included in there as well. We're working with a group of campaigns that are called Reinvest in Our Power, and we're working among foundations with a project we're calling Shake the Foundations, which has to do with trying to get some of the funds divested from foundations as they seek to become more mission aligned, reinvested in the kind of community efforts that we're talking about along the lines of the financial cooperative that have deep democratic roots in grassroots communities. All of this is going to come to an end in 2020 when we hopefully have completed that work that I'm describing and those assets are in the community. But one of the things we've done here in Greensboro, North Carolina, along those lines is the development of the Renaissance Community Cooperative. This was in a neighborhood that Winn-Dixie left in 1998, leaving this eyesore that you can see on the slide. When we first went out and talked to the community about them developing a cooperative solution to this, after they had spent 15 years trying to work on getting somebody else to come in and solve their food desert problem, experts assured us that this community was too Black, too poor, and too uneducated for a successful food co-op. Well, we ignored that sage advice and have been able to move on toward the development of the Renaissance Community Cooperative, which this slide shows John Jones in a community meeting, which is part of that community organizing work that leads toward the kind of strong engagement. We were able to, on several occasions, mobilize several hundred people to go to the city council, calling for the city to also support this effort, along with the initial equity that was raised from memberships within the community. Again, we have one class of members. Everybody pays $100. If you're wealthy, you can pay $100 cash right out of your pocket. If you have less money, you can pay it by paying $5 down and $5 a month until it's paid off. And as soon as you're involved on a payment plan, you're considered a full member in the cooperative, able to elect the board of directors and engage in all the other community processes that shape the direction of that work. This again shows a larger community meeting. Regularly, 50 to 120 people attend community meetings for this grocery store. A previous slide, this shows some of the deliberative processes where people were actually engaged in the process of planning what the RCC store would finally be as it was developed. We enlisted young people and youth activities and celebrations that were part of doing this work. People then engaged in electing a board of directors that now sits there and voting on the existing bylaws for the structure. And now, with over 1,200 community owners, the RCC grocery store grand opening was this past November the 4th, November 4th and 5th in 2016. This slide shows the ribbon cutting out in front. A member of the Food Co-op Initiative, a national organization, was here and said he had never seen a grand opening as grand as the one that happened here in Greensboro. This is a 10,500 square foot store, about 7,200 square feet in retail space, a full service grocery store. It's not a glorified convenience store, nor is it simply a health food store, although certainly the food is much healthier than that which is available in the convenience stores that remain in the neighborhood. Prices are competitive with the Kroger or Food Line or a store of that type. And it's 100% owned and controlled by the community on the basis of one vote per share, but anyone is welcome to come in and shop. And all of the resource, all of the surplus, all of the profit from the store goes back into the community to be determined by the community how it will be spent. This is some more information on how to get in touch with us about that. And I wanted to end with that, and hopefully there's some other questions, but we can put these ideas we have into real practice in terms of trying to create productive assets within communities, along with other things around meeting needs. But the ultimate idea has to be for communities to be able to do things for themselves, rather than always being dependent on piles of resources from outside of those communities, hopefully being benevolent in terms of how they act in community. So we're for building the kind of democratic structures and democratic entities that allow for communities to control the productive assets around the things that they need for themselves. I'm done.
Thanks, Ed, and thanks to all my presenters for presenting. Very important work, and it's also good to see some through lines in terms of some of the connectivity around housing justice, inside-outside game, and also linking it to community power building. So I know we're a little over 11 o'clock, and I know there's a few more participants on the call. I was waiting for, in the comment section, if there's any questions. But one of the questions that I wanted to bring up to everyone is, I think Felicia spoke about this too. It's just, all the speakers spoke about it, but and particularly around this political moment, there are a lot of intersections that are happening that are impacting residents. Dawn alluded to it, Felicia alluded to it. And I just wanted to take a moment just to see if y'all can just extend some of those comments about how are you seeing the housing justice work, the point around housing as a human right connected to other movement and other kind of work that's within your membership. So I just wanted to open it up and just see if there's any direct responses to that question. And if Dawn, you're on the phone, you just go through, I guess, Dawn, if you have any direct response. And then I would start with Dawn and Felicia, and then Sasha and Ed if you have a comment.
Sure. No, and I hope it's okay with the other presenters. I'm just going to quickly go back to one of my slides, and I'll start answering the question. So from the right to the city and the Homes for All perspective, it is critical that we do housing, land, and development justice work in an intersectional manner. We feel like it's actually one of the central tenets and aspects of like our approach, which is that, we have to understand land, housing, and development justice within the context of climate resiliency, within the context of worker rights, within the context of immigrant rights. This is fundamental. So some of what's happening in Right to the City and Homes for All right now, I'll mention a few concrete examples. One is that in this political moment, we are seeing a tremendous upsurge with our groups on the ground that immediately went towards connecting housing rights, housing justice, and immigrant rights and immigrant justice. In Chicago, in the Bay Area, wherever we have groups who are working at the intersection of housing, working with immigrant communities, the need to dually defend folks in terms of their housing as well as their immigration and status and immigrant rights is just something that people are doing. So for example, we're seeing more and more of our groups actually doing meetings where they are simultaneously talking about both issues. We actually, as a result of that, we have a webinar coming up in a couple of months that's called, No Evictions, No Deportations, right? So in our minds, there's a direct connection. I mean, in every way that, working class communities of color, that includes immigrant communities, are being impacted by the housing crisis, needing to defend and support folks around the new current threats around deportation, around the things like the Muslim ban, like all the threats to immigration. I think that we see these as being like critical. The second thing I would mention is that as Right to the City on the national level, we are coming together in a formal partnership with Grassroots Global Justice, Climate Justice Alliance, and the Indigenous Environmental Network as a formation we're calling It Takes Roots, to really actually connect the work cross-alliance, understanding that, none of our national alliance as a single entity are in a position to effectively deal with this Trump moment, right? So that there is a critical need to do that work. And that formation is taking a huge role in the upcoming People's Climate March that's going to be happening both in D.C. And around the country. And then that formation is working very closely with the Movement for Black Lives and Mi Gente, as well as a bunch of other groups, including Fight for 15, et cetera, on the national level, to connect a week of resistance that will start with the People's Climate March and culminate in May 1st, right? Mm-hmm. So just imagining how do we connect? So it's both connecting to some extent beyond the issues, but it's also connecting beyond the alliances and beyond the movements. And then the last thing I'd say really quickly is that, I think that we need to think about both simultaneously kind of centering the leadership of communities of color, most impacted communities in this kind of political moment. But the challenge for many of us is also going to be the work of creating opportunities and methods for engagement with communities beyond. So, examples of the Women's March, examples of a lot of the kind of mobilizations that happen across the country at airports when the president announced his Muslim ban, those types of kind of more simultaneous types of resistance. Really, to some extent, many of us are thinking and talking about how to connect those that energy, those interests with really what are historic struggles that have, for many of, Black, Latino, immigrant communities, et cetera, communities of color, Asian communities in this country have been long-term struggles around things like land, housing, and climate justice. How do we connect those things with some of the emerging momentum?
That's right. Well, thanks for that, Donna. The reason I brought up the question, and others can jump in here too, is just more like, some of the funder partners that we've been talking to at NFG is the intersectionality piece is really important in terms of issue and also in terms of connecting it to their grant making. So I think the framework around the housing justice, I like the way Felicia framed it as the democratic or democracy, the role of investing and organizing. I think those connections are really critical, and so I just wanted to kind of continue that thread. So before anybody else want to add into the conversation, I just want to also, there was a comment about really balancing what's happening, the housing work or the intersectional work that's happening in the urban areas, but also looking at the rural areas too. I know that's the area of work that I know many funders are interested in, that we're doing place-based grant making. Want to get a better understanding from you all. How is there some connection to rural areas or rural-related work? So continue to thread on the intersectionality piece, but also if folks want to respond to the more rural areas, how are people organizing or doing work in those places?
Sure. This is Felicia. I just have a couple quick responses. On the intersectionality piece, I just want to say that we are seeing that immigrants and refugees are at the top of the list to be targeted by shady landlords. They're making up their own practices right now, and so these two issues are definitely linked. We're trying to do a better job at linking them in the actions that we're doing. But, landlords will just make up, you're going to have a $200 fee for being a day late on your rent, or, we can't fix this because of this, or, just some really nasty stuff. Even code enforcement folks in a couple of our municipalities are, there are 2 or 3 families living in one home because that's the choice that they have, and they're getting tickets for, too many cars or too many trash cans. So definitely there's lots of intersectionality. I will say that, there still is, I think, a little bit of a struggle on the ground to figure out how to connect the dots to all of our movements. We are still probably having 1 to 2 actions every single week and having to decide, which ones our organization leads or participates in and supports. And so I would say that that's a challenge that we've got to figure out because, again, I do think it's all connected. And I do believe that at the end, this is a fight for our democracy. So And the other thing I would just add on the rural piece is our organization specifically doesn't work in rural, but I had the opportunity to do a tour in rural Colorado last year. And, living in an urban center, I had lots of incorrect assumptions about what was happening rurally. And rural folks are having the same issues. Rents have gone up. There are lots of folks with second, third, and fourth homes that are moving to our mountain communities, leaving, there's just no housing for the working folks in those communities. And so you're seeing displacement. You're actually seeing homelessness in a lot of these smaller rural towns that you wouldn't expect. And so one of our goals of our grassroots housing table is to have chapters of Homes for all around our state.
Go ahead, Sasha. You can
and
go
really
first.
Connect the housing pain and the housing issues of
Right.
everyone across the state into one movement.
One of the groups that we work with is the Federation of Southern
Others
Cooperatives
on rural
that
issues
is rooted most deeply in the
helpful.
Black Belt
Any other
South
comments
and has
about
been
that?
around for 50 years and as an
Ed or
outgrowth of
Sasha?
the civil rights movement.
This is Sasha.
The changing times are requiring it to, in addition to the work that it continues to do with farmers and trying to help with land retention and such things, also look into questions of housing in rural communities. So we still have organizations in these rural areas that are doing work. A large portion of the rural communities in the South continue to be made up of African Americans who, retain some connection there and have ever since our enslavement in this area of the country, and others who have left and are returning to the South in various capacities and looking for opportunities to make good use of that land. Again, these productive assets to meet needs. And the last thing I wanted to say is that we can talk about the human rights aspect of this, but to us at F4DC, it's more fundamental to talk about the question of housing as a human need, and that people need the power and access to the resources that are required to meet their own needs. This framework is to us more useful in talking about the kind of self-reliance that is required and possible. So we need to begin looking at how do we facilitate, particularly in local areas, the development of both the power and the access to the resources so that people can meet their own needs rather than the ongoing calls to rights, which again expect that some existing concentration of power and resources somewhere else is going to come in on the moral call, and they should, but they won't necessarily actually do that and satisfy these needs that we have.
Mm-hmm.
So this is Sasha. Can I chime in?
Sure, go for it.
I'll be quick, I promise. So many of Grounded Solutions members are rural community land trusts and other affordable housing programs who are stewarding affordable units. And I think it definitely is the case that affordability challenges are being experienced across rural America, not only in the cities. And I think that the solutions are actually many of the same solutions in both a rural area and an urban area. They just need to be tailored differently. So a community land trust in a rural area looks different than a community land trust in downtown Detroit. And an inclusionary housing policy in a rural county looks different than an inclusionary housing policy in a major metropolitan area. So when I talk with people about the policy toolkit, the whole suite of strategies that we can implement to create more inclusive development, it's not about which policy you choose. It's about how you get the details right for your place. And I think that in this political moment especially, it's so important that we remember that one of the reasons that these conversations are siloed is that people become very technically expert on a very narrow area of policy. And that has strengths and weaknesses. The strength is that they understand the details of some particular policy well enough to know what the unintended outcomes are going to be if they don't get it right. And the weakness is that they lose sight of how it all affects the same people at the end of the line, and that they sort of lose sight of that intersectionality. But I think that we need to also keep track of the importance of being careful and detail-oriented in our policy strategies.
Yeah, that's helpful. And it just reminded me, too, this is a question about the rural-urban connections. This sounds like something that we can potentially look in terms of. One of the things that we're doing, beginning to have the conversations with Sasha, is pulling together a couple more webinars to go a little deeper around some of these content areas, policy areas, and developing a couple webinars. And I think there are definitely some content-rich things we can think about that could potentially fit into those, Sasha. And I just wanted to kind of, we're getting close to the 11:30 mark here. And I wanted to see, for those that are still in the call, I just want to thank you all for staying on, those that are participating, and for, once again, thank our speakers. And I just want to kind of close with, with a deep appreciation for this work. There's so much happening right now. And for our funded leaders who are doing the due diligence internally in their institutions to understand what's happening in places, specifically around the points that were made around immigration and housing, the intersectionality between various movements, and then also the through line between investing in organizing and inside-outside strategies are just all really critical and crucial. And, all four of our thought leaders that provided input and information today has been, you've been an exemplary in just sharing your ideas and input, and I just want to encourage this as being just a starting conversation, but we will definitely want to continue to have more in-depth conversations over the course of the year. I also want to kind of close with two other things. There's a couple webinars that are kind of like they're in the process of being developed, some work around issues around HUD, what's going on at the federal level. Obviously, the speakers actually spoke about some of those connections, and so that's something that we want to figure out more as each of you, the presenters and others, are looking into this work. Definitely keep our program, the Democratized Development Program, abreast to what you're developing. I think there's a lot of critical points. And then the point around the rural-urban, what we're seeing, I think, Sasha, your points around that is really great, and I just think there's an area to explore that a little bit more. And then lastly, we are in the process of pulling together a learning event in Pittsburgh. I know Sasha said that Grounded Solutions is doing some work in Pittsburgh, but one of the things that we're in the process of doing is having a learning tour on June 19th to the 21st, June 19th to the 21st, to explore some of these strategies in real time in place, because the city of Pittsburgh is also looking at the same dynamics between urban and then also the rural areas, and then also looking at the intersections of housing, just economic development in general, job creation, and how to keep residents and equally engaged and involved with those processes. And I know, Sasha, you have a lot to say about that, but I just wanted to put a plug for that for those on the call. That's an opportunity to really work with some of the leadership in the Democratized Development Program, but also Hines Endowment and an organization called Pittsburgh United, who is doing work in Pittsburgh as well around this intersectional work and looking at racial justice and social justice issues that's happening in the city. So I just wanted to put a plug for that as well. And then I'm just going to generally just close the call. See, before I close the call, I just want to know if there's any other last comments from our presenters on specific things that are upcoming, or other things that people should potentially be aware about.
You know what? I wanted to take this opportunity and build off what you were saying. The Grounded Solutions Network is working with NFG to produce a series for funders to discuss and learn about housing affordability and equitable development issues. And we have an outline for 2 webinars and also for an in-person convening that I'm really excited about, but I really want feedback from you all about whether we are on the right track and have outlined the issues in the way that you want to talk about it. So it would be super helpful to me if there's anybody on the call, and you could just write your name in the chat box, who would be willing to have like a 15-minute or a 30-minute phone call